Take your dusty books and go back to your pathetic librarian father. We're done. Those were the exact words my husband, Preston, said as he dropped a manila envelope onto my desk. The divorce papers were clipped perfectly to the rendering of his newest commercial skyscraper. He stood there in his custom suit, a newly minted lead architect, looking down at me like I was a drafting error he finally had the power to erase. He expected tears. He wanted me to beg him to let me stay in our sprawling home. Instead, I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my pen, flipped directly to the last page, and signed my name, Valerie. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. 30 minutes later, I walked out with a single cardboard box. My husband had absolutely no idea I was about to demolish his entire career. Before Preston was designing glass towers, he couldn't even afford drafting paper. 9 years ago, we shared a single carton of cold Chinese takeout on the floor of a damp, mold-smelling studio apartment. I spent every night wide awake, manually sorting thousands of historical files for my archival job just to cover our rent. I managed every late notice, scheduled every exam, and kept our lights on so he wouldn't have to think about anything except perfecting his very first architectural sketch. I quietly poured my 20s into his ambition, giving him the solid foundation he needed to build his life. Now, he was evicting me from the very reality I had financed. I didn't pack the expensive earrings he bought to show off at corporate dinners. I walked into his immaculate home office and took the only thing that actually belonged to me. It was that original, faded pencil sketch on cheap paper, the one he drew 9 years ago when we had nothing. I placed it carefully, at the bottom of my cardboard box. Then, I left my house keys on the granite kitchen island. Losing my home and my 10-year marriage in a single morning was a heavy price to pay for my dignity. But standing on the sidewalk in the crisp air, I didn't cry. My hands were perfectly steady. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call a standard divorce attorney. And I certainly didn't call my father's local library. I dialed a secure, unlisted internal number I hadn't used since the day I got married. It rang exactly twice. Legal compliance, a professional voice answered. "This is Valerie," I said. "I need an immediate extraction." The voice on the other end of the secure line belonged to David, the senior compliance officer for my family's private financial trust. I hadn't dialed his direct extension since the week before my wedding. "Valerie," he said. The line was completely free of static. "What do you need?" "I need my personal sealed file located," I told him. "And I need a temporary residence by tonight. Something quiet." Within 3 hours, I was sitting on a gray fabric sofa in a furnished corporate apartment across town. It wasn't the custom-built house I had just left. The walls were bare, but the deadbolt worked. And Preston didn't have the key. That was my only victory for the day. The price for that distance arrived exactly 12 minutes later. My phone vibrated with an automated banking alert. Then a second one. Then 3 more in rapid succession. Preston had moved fast. He froze our joint checking account at Chase. He transferred every dollar out of our shared savings. He canceled the primary credit cards. He wanted to make sure I walked away with empty pockets right before his grand skyscraper inauguration on Saturday. He calculated that cutting off my cash supply would force me to panic, accept whatever pathetic settlement he offered, and quietly disappear from his new high society life. I set the phone face down on the coffee table. I didn't cry. I opened my cardboard box and reached past my clothes. I pulled out the faded pencil sketch. I am 32 years old, for nearly a decade. My official title was Historical Archivist for the City Records Department, but my actual full-time job was serving as Preston's invisible scaffolding. I carefully smoothed out the curled edges of the brittle paper. 9 years ago, he drafted this on our kitchen floor. Back then, he couldn't even afford the filing fees to register for his architectural licensing exams. I paid them. I worked 60-hour weeks, cataloging municipal records in a windowless basement to make sure our rent was never late. I tracked his deadlines. I managed his study schedule. I cooked exactly 2,400 dinners while he studied. I spent 9 years acting as the mortar holding his ambition together so he could finally build his name. Now, he was standing at the top of a glass tower, looking down at me, deciding I was a stain on his pristine new foundation. I ran my finger over the smudged graphite lines. He wasn't just discarding our marriage. He was actively erasing my existence from his success story. He wanted his new wealthy colleagues to believe he was a self-made visionary who had dragged a useless, uneducated wife as far as he could. I stopped looking at the sketch. I picked up my phone again. I bypassed the frozen bank alerts and drafted an encrypted email to David. I need the original physical copy of Document 4A pulled from my vault. Not a digital scan. The original. I hit send. I had spent my entire 20s protecting Preston. I hid my family's wealth, my actual influence, and my father's true identity. Also, Preston's fragile ego could grow into real confidence. I thought I was nurturing a partnership. I was actually just financing my own eviction. David replied within 2 minutes. The document will be unsealed and waiting. What exactly are you planning to do with it? I locked my screen. I didn't owe him an answer yet. At exactly 10:15 on Wednesday morning, the heavy oak doors of the Historical Archives Center swung open. Preston did not whisper. He never adjusted his volume for the room he was in. His leather shoes echoed across the polished marble floor, cutting through the silence. He bypassed the public sign-in sheet entirely. His presence drew the eyes of 3 elderly researchers at the reading tables and my supervisor, Helen. He walked straight to my circulation station and tapped his knuckles on the wood. I need the 1909 Burnham architectural folio, he said. He didn't say hello. He checked his watch. Have it brought up from the basement. I'm double parked in a loading zone. I kept my hands resting on my keyboard. This is a closed stack archive. Preston, you need a verified research application. I don't need to read it. I need a prop, he corrected. Leaning over the counter, my CEO, Donovan, has an obsession with vintage urban planning. I'm placing the folio on my podium for the inauguration speech on Saturday. It makes me look rooted in city history. Just grab it. He spoke to me the exact same way he spoke to the junior draftsman he constantly complained about. I looked at his hand on my desk. He wore a platinum watch. I bought him his first drafting compass at a yard sale for $4. I spent 72 months buying generic pasta and keeping our winter thermostat at 60 degrees just so he could afford his rendering software. I paid his state licensing fees 3 separate times because he failed the exams on his first 2 attempts. He didn't just break a marriage. He walked away with a massive unpaid invoice, wearing a $3,000 custom suit financed entirely by my quiet endurance. No, I said. Preston blinked. He looked around the quiet room. Helen was pretending to read a catalog, but she was absolutely listening. Excuse me, he asked. His voice dropped, but the edge sharpened. I am not checking out a rare historical document for you to use as a stage prop, I said. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my drawer and slid it across the counter. But since you drove all the way down here, you can sign this. He glanced at the paper. It was a standard property release form. I left 2 boxes of my grandmother's books in the guest room. I told him, sign the release, and I will come pick them up tomorrow. Preston stared at the printed form, then looked back up at my face. He laughed. It was a short, dry, dismissive sound. He pushed the paper back across the wood. You aren't stepping foot in my house, he said, and you are definitely not making demands. It is a simple release form. Preston, you think you can play games because I froze your accounts, he said, stepping back from the desk. He straightened his silk tie. You have absolutely no idea how out of your depth you are, Valerie. I'm not dealing with a bitter ex-wife who catalogs old newspapers for a living. He turned toward the exit, stopping right before the heavy doors. I'll have my firm's legal team handle you, he said, projecting his voice loudly enough for the entire reading room to hear. Expect a letter. He pushed the doors open and walked out. The oak doors clicked shut behind him. I slid the unsigned property release back into my drawer. I didn't shake. I didn't apologize to my supervisor for the disruption. I just looked at the empty space where he had been standing. Let the lawyers write. The heavy envelope arrived by certified mail on Thursday afternoon. It was printed on thick, cream-colored linen paper. Preston hadn't just hired a standard divorce lawyer. He was using the corporate legal team from his architectural firm. The letter was a formal cease and desist. It stated that if I attempted to claim any financial stake in the new commercial skyscraper, they would bury me in litigation. They wanted me terrified. They wanted me to believe that a city archivist with frozen bank accounts couldn't possibly fight a corporate machine. I didn't call them to argue. I took my lunch break at noon on Friday and walked 4 blocks to their downtown office. The lead counsel was a man named Marcus. He kept me waiting in the lobby for 45 minutes. When his assistant finally let me in, he didn't offer me a seat. He leaned back in his leather chair and looked at my sensible shoes. "Your husband is designing the tallest building in the district, Valerie," Marcus said. He spoke slowly, like he was explaining traffic rules to a child. "You make $42,000 a year cataloging old newspapers. You cannot afford a single week of litigation against us. Sign the standard settlement, take the remaining furniture, and walk away." I didn't defend my salary. I didn't defend my marriage. I opened my purse and took out a single sheet of paper. I placed it perfectly in the center of his glass desk. "This is a formal request to unseal the original physical copy of our prenuptial agreement," I said. Marcus barely glanced at it. He let out a short, dismissive breath. "Denied," he said. "It is a standard legal request," I replied quietly. "Not for this project," Marcus said, tapping his pen against the glass. "The skyscraper is funded by a private blind trust. The investors operate entirely behind a web of anonymous shell corporations to prevent exactly this kind of interference. Unsealing any financial documents tied to that trust requires a direct signature from their board of directors. A city librarian doesn't get to bypass billionaire-level security protocols." He pushed the paper back toward the edge of the desk. "You have no leverage here," Marcus said. "You are completely locked out." He was absolutely right about the protocol. The trust was designed to be an impenetrable fortress. My father built it that way on purpose. No outside lawyer, no angry spouse, and certainly no local judge could force their way in without the board's approval. I picked up my piece of paper. I folded it neatly into thirds and slipped it back into my purse. Marcus turned his attention back to his computer monitor. He thought he had just put me in my place. He thought the wall was too high to climb. I already held the keys. I did not wait for Marcus to file his legal injunction. I walked back into the historical archives, bypassed the main circulation desk, and sat down at my quiet workstation. I reached into my purse and took out a small brass key. It unlocked the bottom right drawer of my desk. Beneath a stack of municipal zoning maps from the 1920s sat a heavy, fireproof envelope. Marcus assumed his corporate law firm controlled the only gateway to the blind trust's records. He forgot that a professional archivist always keeps a physical original. I opened the envelope and pulled out our prenuptial agreement. I flipped past the standard asset division clauses and stopped on page 4. I ran my finger over the bold black ink outlining the core assets. It listed a private entity called Vanguard Holdings. It did not use my maiden name. Looking at that page, I thought about my father, Arthur. He built a real estate empire across 3 states, but he drove a 12-year-old sedan and drank diner coffee. He always told me that wealth was simply a tool, and using it to flaunt your status was a very quick way to rot your character. When I met Preston 9 years ago, I wanted a marriage built on equal ground. I wanted someone who loved me, not a trust fund. I never actually lied to him. On our 3rd date, I told him my family managed ledgers and property records in the Midwest. Because of his own deep obsession with high society, he automatically assumed that meant low-income clerical work. I let him believe it. I wanted him to build his own confidence, to take pride in earning his architect license without a safety net. That same obsession with status is exactly what blinded him. On the morning of our wedding, Preston was so absolutely certain I was a poor librarian desperate for his future salary that he signed this contract without reading past page 2. He just scribbled his name and handed the pen back. He never read page 4. He never saw that Vanguard Holdings, the exact private trust funding the construction of his massive new commercial skyscraper, listed me as the sole primary beneficiary. He thought he was discarding a useless wife, completely unaware that he had just divorced the owner of his building. I picked up my heavy steel archival press. I stamped the original document, embossing the seal over the signatures to verify its physical authenticity. Then, I placed it on the glass of my desktop scanner. I did not email the file to Marcus or his legal team. I bypassed the architectural firm entirely and routed the document directly to the secure internal inbox of the Vanguard Holdings Board of Directors. Preston thought he could starve me out before his inauguration speech. I wondered how the board would respond when they realized their lead architect was treating their primary shareholder like trash. By 8:30 on Friday morning, the board of Vanguard Holdings had my unsealed contract. I expected a swift corporate execution. I underestimated how desperately a firm will protect its own public image. At 10:15, I received a certified email from an entirely different set of lawyers. They didn't fire Preston. They stalled. The legal notice stated the board would formally review the ownership discrepancy in 30 days. Marcus and his architectural legal team had convinced the corporate board to bury the scandal until after the grand inauguration on Saturday. They weren't protecting my husband. They were protecting a $400 million real estate launch. They threw up a massive corporate firewall to keep me silenced and entirely locked out of my own building until the ribbon was cut. I didn't try to breach their legal wall. I simply went around it. I drove out to a small, worn-down diner on the edge of the city. My father, Arthur, was sitting in the third booth, drinking black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. He wore a faded flannel shirt. Nobody looking at him would ever guess he owned the private trust funding Preston's new skyline. I slid into the booth and placed 3 pieces of paper on the Formica table: the divorce filing, the cease and desist letter, and the unsigned release for my grandmother's books. Arthur put his mug down. He picked up the papers and read them in complete silence. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. The temperature in his eyes just dropped. He stood in your archives and mocked your job, Arthur said quietly. Yes, I said. Arthur looked down at the heavy corporate cease and desist letter. A man's actual character is exactly how he treats the people he thinks he no longer needs. He folded the papers and slipped them into his chest pocket. Preston wants to be a titan of industry. He wants a high society life. Arthur picked up his coffee. I think it is time we introduced ourselves. He made a single phone call from the diner parking lot. He didn't call the architectural firm, and he didn't call the board of directors. He called a private manufacturing workshop 3 towns over. Down in a dusty basement, a senior craftsman turned on a heavy industrial engraving machine. He clamped down a massive custom-ordered gold-plated brass plaque. It was exactly 36 inches wide. The machine began cutting deep, permanent grooves into the heavy metal. Preston thought he had successfully silenced a helpless archivist. He didn't know the real name of the building's owner was currently being carved in gold. The lobby of the new commercial skyscraper smelled like expensive catering and fresh lilies. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne past towering marble columns. Preston stood near the center of the room, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, laughing loudly at a joke made by his CEO, Donovan. He was completely in his element, soaking in the artificial glow of his own perceived brilliance. He noticed me standing near the entrance. His smile tightened. He excused himself from Donovan and walked toward me, motioning for 3 junior architectural interns to follow him. He wanted an audience. You actually showed up? Preston said. His voice was low, but carrying enough for the interns to hear. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You always did have a hard time letting go of things above your pay grade. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope. He pressed it directly into my hand. There is $5,000 in there, he said smoothly. Consider it a charity donation, a cleanup fee for your trouble. Take it. Go buy some new sensible shoes, and leave before the press arrives. You don't belong here, Valerie. The interns watched me, their faces a mix of pity and second-hand embarrassment. Preston stood tall, waiting for me to break. He expected me to throw the envelope at his chest. He wanted me to cause a scene so he could have security drag the bitter, hysterical ex-wife out of his lobby. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even hand the envelope back. $5,000, I said evenly. Thank you, Preston. I looked away from his smug face and shifted my gaze upward. High in the corner of the vaulted ceiling, a small security camera swept across the lobby floor. A tiny red light blinked on its casing. Preston thought he was at the absolute peak of his power. He thought he was using pocket change to crush the last remaining piece of my dignity. He had no idea that I wasn't looking at a standard security monitor. I was looking directly at a private feed routed straight to the VIP observation suite on the top floor. My father, Arthur, was sitting in a leather chair up there right now, watching the screen. He was already inside the building. And he was watching his son-in-law's true character unfold in high definition, completely unscripted. I didn't need to fight Preston. I just had to wait for the elevator doors to open. Preston's smug smile was still plastered across his face when the heavy traffic outside the floor-to-ceiling windows abruptly stopped. A sudden hush fell over the crowded lobby. I watched Preston turn toward the glass. A convoy of 8 black Rolls-Royces pulled up to the curb, completely blocking the main entrance of the skyscraper. The catering staff stopped pouring champagne. The interns backed away from the doors. 4 men in dark suits stepped out of the lead vehicles, opening the rear door of the center car. My father stepped onto the pavement. He wasn't wearing his faded diner flannel today. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that projected absolute authority. When Arthur walked through the revolving glass doors, the crowd naturally parted for him. Preston frowned, annoyed by the interruption. He opened his mouth to call for security. He never got the chance. Donovan, the CEO of the architectural firm, dropped his champagne flute. It shattered on the marble, the color completely drained from his face as he recognized the man walking toward them. Donovan scrambled up to the podium, aggressively snatched the microphone directly out of Preston's hand, and practically bowed as he stepped aside. "Mr. Chairman," Donovan said, his voice trembling over the speakers. Arthur did not look at Donovan. He did not look at Preston. He walked directly to me. One of his men stepped forward, carrying the brass plaque. Arthur took the microphone. He spoke softly, but the acoustics of the grand lobby carried every word. "This building is a Vanguard Holdings project," Arthur said, looking out at the press, the interns, and the executives. But the true foundation of this skyscraper was not drawn on a drafting table. It was built on 9 years of silent sacrifice, unpaid labor, and unwavering loyalty by the sole primary beneficiary of this trust. Arthur turned and handed the heavy gold plaque to me. It bore my name. "Thank you, Valerie," he said. Preston stared at the gold medal in my hands. His eyes darted from my face to Arthur, and then to Donovan. The reality of the corporate hierarchy finally crushed him. He had just spent the morning mocking the owner of his building. Donovan stepped forward, his face flushed with panic and rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Preston. "You are terminated," Donovan said loudly. "Effective immediately. Vanguard Holdings does not do business with ungrateful men. Get him out of her lobby." Preston broke. His knees literally gave out. He collapsed onto the polished marble floor with a heavy thud. The white envelope slipped from his numb fingers. $5,000 in crisp bills spilled across the pristine tiles. He opened his mouth to speak, to pivot, to beg, but absolutely no sound came out. Two building security guards grabbed Preston by the arms. They hoisted him up and dragged him backward through the center of the crowd, pulling him out of the very skyscraper he had spent his life designing. I stood holding my plaque. I did not smile. 3 weeks later, Marcus, the lead counsel who told me I was completely out of my depth, found out exactly how deep the water actually was. He had tried to intentionally hide the original prenuptial agreement from the Vanguard Holdings Board to protect the inauguration and secure his own firm's reputation. The State Ethics Committee did not care about his skyscraper. Suppressing primary financial documents from a board of directors is a career-ending move. His license to practice law was immediately suspended, pending a full disciplinary hearing. He cleared out his glass desk on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't say a word to his receptionist on the way out the door. Preston didn't fare any better. The architectural community in this city is a very small, very loud circle. Being publicly fired by your CEO and physically dragged out of your own lobby by security is not a resume builder. Donovan blacklisted him. Every major firm followed suit, knowing Vanguard Holdings would instantly pull their backing from any company that even offered him an interview. My ex-husband, the man who demanded a wife fit for a boardroom, now works in a cramped, windowless office in a suburban strip mall. He spends his days drafting minor code renovations for local dry cleaners and parking garages. He drives a used sedan. No one cares about his watch. I went back to work. The Historical Archives Center is exactly as quiet as it has always been. The smell of old paper and dust hasn't changed. I sat at my desk on a Thursday morning. I opened the cardboard box I had carried out of my custom-built house. I reached past my sweaters and took out the faded pencil sketch. 9 years ago, Preston drew this on the floor of an apartment that smelled like mold. I traced the smudged graphite lines with my thumb. I didn't smile. I didn't feel a sudden rush of victory. Winning a divorce doesn't give you your 20s back. Exposing a liar doesn't resurrect the man you thought you were starving for. I placed the sketch flat inside an acid-free archival folder. I closed the heavy cardboard lid, sliding the box onto the lowest shelf in the back row. I never opened it again. An arrogant man will spend his life designing glass towers, completely forgetting that the woman he discarded holds the original blueprints. I know exactly what you are screaming at your screen right now. You're wondering why a smart, capable woman like Valerie waited 9 long years to finally pack her box. Why did she endure the cold dinners, the financial drain, and the blatant disrespect from a man who used her as a stepping stone? The truth is, nobody stays for the abuse. They stay for the illusion of a payout. Psychologists call this the slot machine effect. When you are dealing with a toxic partner or manipulative family member, they don't treat you terribly 100% of the time. If they did, you would just walk out the door. Instead, they give you just enough, a rare compliment, a good day, a promised promotion to keep you pulling the lever. You keep investing your time, your money, and your youth, convinced that the big jackpot of love and respect is right around the corner. Valerie wasn't weak. She was addicted to the potential of the man she married, long after that man had stopped existing. But when she finally woke up, she executed a masterclass in quiet leverage. Let's look at 2 brilliant moves she made to take her life back. First, we have to talk about what I call the physical ledger. When Preston tried to digitally and financially erase her by freezing her bank accounts, he relied on modern corporate firewalls to keep her trapped. Valerie didn't panic. She went to a locked drawer and pulled out the original hard copy paper. Narcissists always underestimate the quiet evidence you keep in the background. They think controlling the present means they control the past. Second, she used the chain of command bypass. When the arrogant lawyer Marcus tried to stonewall her with legal threats and bureaucracy, Valerie didn't waste her time arguing with the gatekeeper. She went straight over his head. She walked directly to her father, the ultimate authority funding the entire project. Never argue with the guard dog when you hold the leash to the owner. Valerie's story is a reminder that true power doesn't need to shout across a lobby. It doesn't need a designer watch or an expensive zip code. Your character is your foundation, and no matter how tall someone else builds their tower of lies, gravity always wins. If you've ever had to quietly rebuild your life after someone tried to erase you, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me your story. And if this video made you feel a little stronger today, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.